Life on the road was not only exciting, but it was hard work, and it wasn't a bed of roses. Uh, Camping out for a week or two is a lot of fun, but a lot of times when you come home, you are quite sore, or you had a lot of fun, but you don't think about doing that, for months or a year on end. But life on the road was that way.
A couple of times in the middle of 3 o'clock in the morning, you went to bed on the dry ground. We had this 40-man, 30-man tent, and we went to bed on the nice dry ground, and it was really exciting. And some of us had air mattresses where you'd blow up, and then we blew them up, and then we'd put our sleeping bag on top of it, and you went to bed at night looking at the stars. Oh, I told you we were in a tent. Well, the reason you could see the stars because our tent had holes in it, you see. And sometimes you would wake up in the morning, a little drips on your face because the rain would be coming through. But sometimes in the morning, now this is the gospel truth, sometimes in the morning you'd be floating in your tent. The rain would come in underneath the sides of the tent, and there'd be 30 or 40 guys floating around in this tent, and we'd all be laughing and cracking up because some of the guys would wake up like this. They'd go, oh, plat, and their hands in about 6 inches of water. It'd freak them out. Oh, what's this? Ooh.
Oh, I loved every minute of being on the road. I mean, it was difficult. We slept in the tent. I remember one night I was sleeping in a certain spot in a tent, but for some reason there was another brother who wanted my spot, so I moved to another spot. And all of a sudden in the middle of the night I woke up and the whole tent was flooded. Everybody's sleeping bag, everything was wet except my little spot I was sleeping in. I still had a dry spot. But then we all got up and we dug ditches around the tent so the water would drain off.
And I remember my sleeping bag for 2 or 3 days, there's nothing you could do to dry it out. It's just you had to hang it up and pray to God. And your clothes, when we would drive on the road, sometimes you'd have to take your underwear or your shirts or something and tie it on your radio antenna or your bumpers and drive and pray to God that it would dry out, through driving so fast.
When you joined the Lord's army, must have been many things you didn't realize. Your face was your first battle, and you acted so darn surprised. So you found in the midst of battles, saying I must have done some awful sin. Well, if you didn't expect to go to war, why'd you ever join the Lord's army, my friend, my friend? Why'd you ever join the Lord's army, my friend?
Bear Creek Park was one of the last places that the last park that we stayed at before, I believe we went to TSC. There was another place we went to, which was like a little lot or an old church camp, old church ground where some deserted church was. So we parked before I think we went actually to TSC. Well, at Bear Creek Park, we were able to get quite a few disciples, some really good disciples there, because it was a very unique situation in which on the weekends cars would come in and just bumper to bumper just drive around. They wouldn't come out of their cars. A lot of people were scared, but just come by and just watch us and look at us in our little lifestyle with our tents and our cooking and what we do. And we go out and some of them would pull over and stop and we'd talk, and that's where we met like Cephas and Shiloh and Apollos and different ones.
As we get closer to the family where they're camped out, we enter into the campground, and he's saying it's up here a ways, you've got to drive into the campground. And this spirit of like the fear of God and the awe, it was almost like there was a bubble around the camp, and I could feel it. Like before I could see it, I could feel this awesome spirit of like confrontation of, I'm going to meet this thing that I think I've been waiting for, So we drive up, and I see Big Heart, and Bezaleel and all these guys. They have a Volkswagen van jacked up under a tree, and they're all greasy, and they dropped the engine out of it, and they're trying to repair the engine. And there's school buses and an army truck, and there's all these different sisters over with wash tubs, you know, scrubbing clothes. And I just looked at it all, and I thought, my God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. You know, this big circle and tents, and you know, people cooking and fanning fires, and a couple of little children over in one corner. And
of course, we had to endure rain, and we had to endure sleet, and we had to endure cold and funny types of foods. But the Lord would always send along some very funny experiences to keep us all in good spirits and to give us, you know, give us a little level-headed. I can remember this real funny thing that Dad came down, and of course, when Dad would come down and give a class, you know, everyone would just be like there, like sucking and drawing and, yeah, amen, and Dad would come down and give these classes, and he'd bring up subjects from anything, you know. And then one time he gave a class on Bible knowledge, and he got into this long dissertation. You know how Dad is, a few words of introduction, a few wee words of introduction. It went on for several hours, I'm sure, at least 5. And the class was on Bible knowledge and how the King James Bible came about, and why the Old English is so pure and wonderful and wholesome, and carries a punch with it. And so somehow one of the brethren, Jim Ballas or something, got this prophecy at the end of the class about how we should speak the King James language. So it was real late at night. Everyone went to bed. But the next morning, you could have swore that Shakespeare is outside of your tent, or some English king was walking down the street with his queen, or the Duke of Enzor was over in the next tent, because everyone started greeting each other in Old English or talking in Old English. It was a fun, I mean, I remember waking up. I wasn't so fast to catch it. I was a little slow, but some of the other brethren, like Ebed and some of the others, really got into it real quick in the morning. They would be going, "Oh, whattest thou as the goodest day as it is, and O ye of wonderful faith, howest beest thou as this beautifulest morningest?"
Wouldest thou bring me the toilet paper? I mean, you were not supposed to speak anything unless you spoke like that, you know. I mean, for me, because I had the children, you know, I was thinking, how can I do this? I just was the quietest I ever was, because like, how are you going to talk like that, you know? And boy, Dad got us together, and it didn't last very long. He got us all together. I remember that meeting in the house. It was a smaller house, and boy, he covered all about false prophecies and all of this. But it just shows you what we could get into if we didn't have Dad.
Just watching the way that the love that Dad had, you know, just, I sat right in front of him, you know, sitting on the, you know, the grass of a tent, you know, a grassy floor, and Coleman lanterns, you know, going up hung up from the ceiling and freezing cold, and everybody huddled together, and Dad's sitting there in a lawn chair, you know, just preaching away. And it was just so, well, it was just so inspiring. It was so, he was so full of love, you know, and then when the prophecies would come and people would prophesy, he would just, son, I know you got something, go ahead and give it, Jimmy, just don't be afraid, you know, just like in the Spirit Revolution, you know, when he would encourage people to speak. That's the way it was, you know. He would hear somebody's tongues, you know, and there would be, you know, sometimes you could hear it too, like you'd think, wow, that's something significant, but he would call on that person, don't hold back, give it, son, give it, you know.
Or my major impression of Dad, when he would come and teach, he'd always take about a half an hour to just really drive the point home, to not get our eyes on him, to not look at him, to not look at the person, but to just really that the Lord was just using him, and that the Lord was just speaking to him, and that it was all the Lord, and it didn't have anything to do with him. That really is the outstanding thing I remember from Dad teaching. And then he would go into the classes or whatever needed to be taught, and he wouldn't beat around the bush just like he does in the Mo letters, you know. But that's the main personal outstanding thing that I remember from Dad teaching.
He was everything. He organized the camp. He organized the organizers. He was our inspiration. He was our main teacher. Outside of and then there was Josh, who taught a lot, and Hosea, but Dad was there. He did everything. He was there with us all the time. Every night we had prayer and classes after dinner in the tent, and the boys' tent was the biggest, so that's where we would have it, and we would have classes. And then at night, I remember once we were in Missouri, I think when Megiddo's wife, Mara, joined, and I had the runs really bad, and I was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and Papa, like he mentions in the letter, he actually did it, and there was one morning I'd seen him. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. He and Mama were walking around to all the tents and the campers, checking everyone, and it just touched me. I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, he should be sleeping, you know. He's probably tired, but he was walking. He everything. He was our shepherd. He was our prophet. He was our guide. He taught us this. Everything. He was everything.
I remember Dad constantly, every single night. I mean, I can still see it. I can still remember the little knock on my tent. The little when you knock on a tent, it's not a knock. It's kind of rip, something like that. I can remember at nighttime, 11, 12 o'clock at night, little dip on the side of my tent, and there'd be Dad bending down in the rain or in the cold with Maria at his side, peeking in and saying, "Good night, son. Everything fine with you?" And I remember looking at him and all the time saying, "Thank you, sir. Everything's fine. God bless you." And he said, "Good night, son. God bless you, too." And he'd go over to the next vehicle and make sure that there's proper ventilation in the windows. He would check to make sure there's proper lighting in the places there need to be proper lighting. I have just memories and memories and memories. Every time I do my security check, when I have to do my security checklist at night, I remember how faithful Dad was in always doing his security. And he was the shepherd of our home, and that was his job. He was always overseeing our security and making sure that everything was safe.
It was just so, you know, I can hardly describe it without just falling apart, you know, because here we were, you know, he knew us from nowhere, yet it was as if he had known us for all time. And it's like any fear of the future or any worries about what's it going to be like, you know. I mean, I wasn't in the family but about 2 weeks, you know, and it just was dispelled, you know, by the hugs and the kisses. And he'd always hug you and kiss you and pray for you and say, "God bless you for giving your life to Jesus, and here's a little gift we wanted to give you just to show you how much we love you." And he's always been like that. He's never changed. He's the same exact person that he's always been, loving and caring and always going around, just like he's always said in the letters, you know, I always went around and checked the beds of everybody. He'd Is your bed okay, honey? Do you have everything you need? Are you warm enough? Now watch out for that stove. Don't get it near the curtains or you're going to start a fire in here. Why don't you put some bricks on that gas burner and then it'll throw out some heat in here. It's freezing cold. Look, my God, how do you stay warm in this thing, you know? That's just the way it was, you know? We were living in a Volkswagen bus that had no insulation, so when it would be freezing outside, it was freezing inside, and everybody had a pee can, you know, if you had to go to the bathroom, it was too cold to go outside, so you'd just, you know, take a pee inside the van and put it underneath, and then you wake up in the morning some mornings and it would be frozen, a solid block of ice. And it was really cold. That was the coldest I've ever been in my whole life.
But then there was the Hallelujah showers, and we took them outdoors. Sometimes some of these campsites in Texas and on the road would have these outdoor shower areas where you would walk into these cement stalls, and you could see the stars. Usually they were open completely, and you turn on the water, and you'd start screaming at the loud of your voice, "Hallelujah! Hallelujah! Hallelujah!" Oh, oh, because the water was so cold it could almost come out in ice cubes. And you were so dirty, though, you had to do it.
If you hadn't gotten the gift of tongues on the road, well, you took a hallelujah shower and you got the gift of tongues. You'd be praising the Lord and singing hallelujah until you just about got the gift of tongues. Or you would hear people, you know, speaking in tongues and everything, because that water was so cold. I mean, it was freezing. You had to shout.
So after we moved through those parks, that was when it was almost unbearable. There was a lot of sickness. A lot of people had colds, and the you know, a lot of sleet, because it's not cold enough where it snows so much, but it rains ice, you know, and it's just the most biting, freezing cold. I can remember one day going out at one of the parks, and we didn't have a latrine dug yet, but you could either go to a latrine or you could go way out in the woods and just do your business, you know. And I had long underwear, one-piece long underwear, and a couple of sweaters, a couple of shirts, and a coat, and just a hood and everything. I went out to the woods to go to the bathroom. I pulled, you have to strip down and pull everything off, you know. I had to take everything off, including the top of my long underwear, to be able to go and do a BM. So and I'm leaning back against a tree in the woods, and all of a sudden I discovered that I had gone to the bathroom on top of my long underwear. So I had to take all my clothes off, you know, and strip completely naked in the middle of this, you know, like frozen forest, you know. It's just, oh, that was so cold, so agonizing cold.
It was so cold, I would set the diapers outside, and the next day we'd have to build a fire and unfreeze them.
They'd hang out the diapers on the line to dry, and then in the morning you could just pick them up and stack them like plates. They were frozen. It was really cold.
And it was hard. I remember my hands would just be red. And I go, well, if I can't take this, I'm certainly not going to be able to take a great tribulation.
It certainly made real dedicated disciples, those days on the road. Sifted out a few that couldn't make it, definitely. There were those that dropped out, but for the rest, it really drew them to greater dedication and commitment rather than lesser. In actuality, I think a lot of those new babes, and I think a lot of them were even, you know, just as much a martyr as any of those that were burned at the stake, because they were having to die daily. I mean, it wasn't just a one-time thing. They were really suffering every day, and you know, the deprivation and the cold and the food. I mean, our tummies were filled, but you know, some people didn't stomach the Milo too well, and they spent a lot of time on the toilet, you know. They would have the runs a lot of the time. That's when Aaron started to be more sickly, was because he was one of those ones that couldn't really stomach the Milo too much, and he had the runs most of the trip, and like he became very thin and quite sickly, and had walking pneumonia. Anyway, those days are very precious memories, because as shepherds, we had to really watch our little babies go through a whole lot that we had never had to go through as babes in Christ. And, you know, we couldn't do too much about it. We pray. I mean, we spent a lot of time. I remember going around from place to place, laying hands on people and praying for the sick. But you know, most of these kids were teenagers, and they didn't even know hardly how to take care of themselves, much less when they were sick. And so, those of us who were well, thank the Lord, I don't remember. I remember going around and praying for people. I don't actually remember being sick except maybe with a cold. But I would go around and pray for the sick along with the other leaders. But it was just almost more, I guess it's the way mothers feel, you know, when they see their children sick. It's just almost more than you can bear. You'd rather be sick yourself than to see your little one sick. So it was quite hard. And I can see why Dad, you know, finally got the faith to go and do what seemed impossible, which was to go and persuade Fred to let us use the ranch, because here he was the shepherd, and he was always concerned about everyone, and always would go. He didn't just stay in the ark, you know, and just not do anything. I mean, he was always going out and making the rounds, sometimes a few times a day, to see how was everybody, were the blankets properly, you know, spread around, and was there anything more we could possibly do with what we had, and telling us to appeal to the newspapers for more help. And I think he even got the faith to send the provisioners out again, and we started to even get Kentucky Fried Chicken finally from dear old Colonel Sanders. God bless those people, because they might have saved a few lives, and in saving a few lives, maybe thousands of souls that those lives eventually saved, because that fried chicken really came at a time when we really needed it, and we started getting it regularly when we really needed the protein. And the Lord, you know, started to strengthen the disciples, but still people were quite weak and quite sick. And we knew that we had to get them out of the cold and off the ground, and that something had to give, that the Lord, you know, we weren't just to die out there in the wilderness. The Lord did have a promised land, a place prepared for us some way, somehow. We just needed to seek Him for it. We needed to go and ask, and so Dad did.
When it was time to go to TSC, and Dad had made that connection with Fred Jordan, we had provisioned the use through another reverend. This time his name was Reverend Jeters. We used to call him Jeter Eater for short, because he was quite a systemite preacher, you know. Quite a Pharisee, you might say. But the Lord used him to give us this boat in Houston at a place called Allen's Landing, which was located right where all the hippies, it was right next to a street called Love Street, the hippie hangout for Houston, which was great for us because it was the best place we could witness.
It was really exciting. That's where we won Singing Sam, and you wanted to be on the team, you know, that was sent out on the bus to Allen's Landing every week, you know, to go there and witness, and then the teams rotate and change. And one exciting thing about going to town was that you might get a hot shower, which was really exciting in those days, because who had felt a hot shower in many, many months, you know, and someone opened up an apartment where actually we really first met Sam was in this apartment where someone was allowing us to go and take showers. And Sam's first view of the family was all these disciples filing in to take showers, and while others were witnessing to his doped up friends, and he was sitting in the corner watching all the action.
One person would come out of the shower, and then they'd latch on to somebody and witness more. And I got interested in what they were saying because they spoke with such conviction. And I was really impressed with how much conviction they had, because at that time, a lot of the hippies and people that were into drugs and that subculture, they would just latch on to any new thing that came up. But these guys were like really preaching like they believed in something, and they weren't about to be persuaded by anything else. So that really convinced me that these guys were different. So I talked to them as they were leaving, and Faithy came to the door and said, "Oh, let's go. These guys don't want to really hear it," and they all left, and I was really shocked to see how they would obey this little 19-year-old girl. And so as the last one was leaving, which was Watchman, I said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you guys, but I'm not going to let you get in my head, and I've got my own trip," and trying to let him know that I wasn't going to be easy, But he just looked me right in the eye and said, "I know what you've been going through. You've taken a lot of drugs, you've had some bad acid trips, and you're wondering where it's all at." And he just spoke with such authority. He was only 17 years old. And I was just shocked that he knew my whole life and just told me what I was going through. You could see it in my eyes. And when that happened, I was never the same. I kept visiting. For the next 2 weeks, I visited the boat where they were staying there at Allen's Landing.
Actually, the street is up here, and this landing is down this steep hill. And then there was a little boat, a little boat that we were staying on, like a merchant boat, I guess. But it was just docked, and so we were able to even set up a band there, and that's how we'd attract the people by our music, and then they'd come down there, and then we could witness to them.
But at Allen's Landing, every night, there would be literally, some nights, thousands of people would be there listening, and we'd witness, because the band would be playing, but then about 50 others of us would be milling around in the crowd, just witnessing, inviting people to have donuts, and hot cocoa, because we had all kinds of provision stuff, and we'd have big hot things of coffee and donuts. And I remember this one night, Josh was witnessing to this guy who was a pastor at the First Baptist Church, which was a huge Baptist church in downtown Houston. They do TV, church, type thing. But anyway, one of his deacons was there, and he was saying, "Do you know that our ministry is one of the most effective in all the city, and we're so proud of our church and our," he was really rapping away, and he said, "You know how many souls we won last year alone? 215 souls, or 201 souls, And I'll never forget it, because Josh said, "I want you to turn around right now, and I want you to look out there." And there was like about 4 or 5 groups of like 15 here, 5 here, kids on their knees, just weeping, receiving the Lord. It was just, he said, "You know how many people have gotten saved here tonight? 200, and we're not even halfway through the night. And you're telling me about 200 souls in your giant church that got saved in the whole last year, 1969? There's more than 200, he calls over Job or somebody like that, and he says, "How many people have gotten saved so far?" Because we would have like a roving supervisor that would kind of keep tabs on things. And it was over 200 people had already gotten saved that night. It was just, the guy was just pale, just...
So Allen's Landing was our taste of real being on the front lines again, real witnessing attack, and being back in the big city. But then we rotated the teams, and they'd go out for Bible study and witnessing out there. So we won disciples there, and I'm sure we're still known around those parts. Well, I guess that was the end of Houston. We pulled out with about 25 disciples. The weather was too much. The Lord opened the door at Hockley. We stayed there, and then Dad arrived back. Dad installed us in Hockley. We had this little church where we could at least be up, off the floor. Wasn't much protection from the weather, but we were thankful for it. And we didn't have any more openings in the campgrounds, so it was the only place to go, really. And then Dad came back from California, flew to California for 3 days, came back. He walked into the church in his suit with his little plastic handkerchief. He had this little handkerchief that was cloth, but if you pulled it up, you stuck it in your suit pocket, but if you pulled it up, it was plastic underneath. was not all hanky. So, so he walks in, and of course all the disciples are shocked to see him in a three-piece suit, number one. I mean, just, he walks up and he tells them, he's just been on this trip and so on, and he says, and you know, Christians are very much like this hanky. Christians today are very much like this hanky, you know. And then he says, you see, they look like Christians on, you know, first glance, but you know, on the outside. But then you pull this out, and what do you have? It's plastic, you know. So it's not the real thing at all. So, oh, the disciples just roared when he did that, you know. He was making fun of this whole get-up, you know, and the system fronts that people put on, and said, well, I had to dress like this, you know, because I had to go out to California and try to get a place for you all to live, and I just couldn't stand to see you suffering anymore, and I couldn't do more for you. I couldn't provide for you. I couldn't help you. I needed help, and couldn't give you what you need. A lot of you were sick, and so I was just desperate to find a home for you.
So this was in about February of 1970. And so we prepared with another trim up, and a few more haircuts and more beards being shaved off.
And one day Hosea came out with these big tin snips, you know, big old shears like that, and he said, you know, and he gave this whole talk about our hair, and people hung up on their hair, and just because you think you look like a hippie, well, maybe you need to get your hair cut, and I'm going to find out who means business today. And he kept, you know, the whole time he's talking for hours, you know, with these snips in his hand. Well, Alf had come. He didn't know the family. He'd came, and because he lived very near Bear Creek Park. It's in a real nice area of town, Spring Branch Memorial area. And he came by and saw what was going on and just sat right outside the circle. You know, and so Hosea is giving this impassioned plea. Are you going to give up your hair? Are you going to break your idols? How long are you going to hold back from the Lord? You know, and all of a sudden Alf just slowly, you know, in tears, you know, just walks out. You know, he says, who's going to be the first one to cut their hair? And he says, I'll do it, cut my hair. I don't want my idols, you know, I can't remember everything he said, but he was just weeping, you know, and sobbing. He was so convicted, you know, and he hadn't even met the family or anything. He was so moved, you know, and he walked out there and got his hair cut, you know, just straight across. It wasn't what we're more used to these days with, you know, a nice trim. And he just got his hair hacked off, you know, with a pair of tin snips, you know, and that's the way he joined the family.
We prepared from Houston. The caravan left and started out on the road, and we traveled at night, and we arrived at TSC at night, just at the crack of dawn in the early morning, so that we were able to get all of our vehicles through the little towns and all to TSC without making a big stir, without people knowing, you know, who we were and what we were doing. And so then when we arrived at TSC, it was very run down, and the cabins were in bad disrepair. But to us, it looked like heaven, because it was like 4 walls with the roof over it. Even if the roof leaked, we could repair it. And we had the dining room then to have our meetings in. And it was quite exciting for us to then have a place where we could live.
surely that. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. David, mighty man, with David's mighty men, with David's mighty men, we're mighty, 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 mighty men. And the sons of strangers shall build up thy walls, and the kings shall minister unto thee. The sons of strangers shall build up thy walls, and the kings shall minister unto thee. David's mighty men, with David's mighty men, with David's mighty men, we're mighty, 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 mighty men. And the sons also of them that afflicted thee shall come bending unto thee, and all they that despise thee shall bow themselves down at the soles of thy feet. David's mighty men, we're David's mighty men, yes, we're David's mighty men, we're mighty, 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 mighty men.
After we'd been at TSC for a couple of months, then we were ready to send out a team to branch out to California. And so a team went back to California and pioneered again in Los Angeles, which is up here. So in Los Angeles. And that's where we started our first outreach from TSC. we then branched out at going towards the east, up here near in Kentucky, near Louisville, Kentucky, in a little town called Elizabethtown, is where the Kentucky farm was located. And so then from Elizabethtown, then we branched out into up here to Cincinnati, and we had our first big pioneer outreach and witnessing outreach in Cincinnati in the east. And then we were from there branched out to up to Akron, Ohio, and Cleveland, and then up to Detroit. Then we started new places in all these different cities, and then over to New York. And so from New York, we then later on were to launch out across the Atlantic to Europe. And from the west coast, then later on, we were to branch out across the Pacific to the east. And that's the story of our early pioneer travels.
One day we were sitting in the Ark, and I believe it was in Miami, and we were praying about something, and we were at this little dining table in the Ark. Dad had his little corner he always sat in on this side of the Ark, and the door was here and a little window here, and I was sitting across from here, and I think there were some others there. I can't remember, but I remember where I was sitting at least, and it seemed like there were some other people there. And we were praying about something, and Dad put up his hand and he was praying, and all of a sudden he started crying. And he says, "I see a vision." He says, "I see all these cars and caravans and trailers, and they're all on the road, you know, and it's us, you know." And he just started weeping. And at that time, there was no trailers, there was no caravans, there were no any other vehicles besides the Ark and the little old black Rambler, and maybe Mary and Mark's their camper and little trailer. But I don't even think they were there at the time. And then years later, not long afterwards, on the road, I remembered that. It came to me one day. Seeing, you know, I don't know if you ever see, there's some pictures of them where it shows all the trailers and trucks. We took a picture showing on the road. There was 29 vehicles and all these things. I went to Dad and I said, "Dad, do you remember? Do you remember the time when you got that prophecy, that little vision? It's true, here it is." And I thought, wow, it's heavy. It's happened. Here it is. And he just looked at me and he said, "It's only the beginning." Here I thought the vision was fulfilled. But his vision wasn't for this little string. His vision was for the whole world.
We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth with the words of David. We're going forth with the words of God. We're going forth with the words of David. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth. the world. We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth to conquer, conquer. We're going forth to conquer the world. We're going forth with the words of David. We're going forth with the words of God. We're going forth with the words of David. We're going forth to conquer